This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neetsahone, and today I'm continuing with my Innistrad Midnight Hunt Limited set review. So far we've looked at all the multicolored, colorless, and white cards, and today we're taking a look at blue. In this video, I'll give my preliminary thoughts on how good I think these cards will be in the upcoming limited format. To sum up my thoughts for each of these cards, I use a letter grade, and if you're not familiar with my letter grade system, you can find an explanation in the description. Alright, let's take a look at our first blue card. First up, we've got Bait Hook Angler, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 human peasant at common, and it's got Disturb for 1 generic and a blue. This is a new mechanic in the set that lets you pay a cost when the creature's in your graveyard, and if you do, it comes back to the battlefield transformed, in this case transformed as Hook Haunt Drifter, a spirit with flying, and if it would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, you exile it instead. This looks like a nice common. A 2-mana 2/1 can trade with lots of stuff, and then the fact that you get another reasonably costed body out of your graveyard is pretty nice. I mean, that's 4 mana for a 2/1 and a 1/2 flyer, and sure, you don't get the bodies at the same time, but that's still a really good deal. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Component Collector, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 1/4 homunculus at common, and if it's neither day nor night, it becomes day as Component Collector enters the battlefield. Whenever day becomes night or night becomes day, you may tap or untap target non-land permanent. So, like this card, there's various cards in the format that do various things when it shifts between day and night. Day and night start to be tracked within games when you play a card like this, or you play a card that has Daybound. I went really deep on this mechanic in the first video in this series, which was the one on multicolored cards. If you want me to hear me go a little bit deeper on it. But yeah, that's basically what it does. And in this case, you get, every time it shifts between night and day, you get to tap or untap a permanent, a non-land permanent, that's relevant. That's okay. This also has decent stats, and the effect will give you some value, but it's not exactly the kind of thing where you're like, boy, if I keep triggering that, my opponent's really going to be in trouble. And I think that means it's just a C-. Next up, it's Consider, which for 1 blue mana is a common instant, and it says look at the top card of your library. You may put that card into your graveyard, draw a card. This format has a Spells Matter deck in blue-red, and there are various graveyard synergies in the format too, so this seems like a decent inclusion. It's a lot like Opt, and that's not a bad comparison. That said, it's also pretty darn replaceable, especially if you're not in a deck that cares about the graveyard or spells, and it will often be easy to cut even in decks that do care about those things. I think it's probably just a C-. Next up, it's Covetous Castaway, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/3 human at uncommon. When it dies, you mill 3 cards, and it has Disturb for 3 generic and 2 blue. And in this case, it comes back transformed as Ghostly Castigator, a spirit, a 3/4 spirit with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you may shuffle up to 3 target cards from your graveyard into your library. This starts by giving you a decent body that loads up the graveyard, and then in the later game, it can give you another somewhat reasonable body that also puts some cards back into your deck. Lots of decks in this format are interested in throwing stuff in the graveyard, including both blue-black and blue-white. This will be a nice inclusion in either of them. Basically, all these cards with Disturb are playable or better, and this is one of the ones that falls into the or better category because the body it gives you in the later game is very relevant. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Curse of Surveillance, which for 4 generic and a blue is a rare aura curse with Enchant Player, and it says at the beginning of Enchanted Player's upkeep, any number of target players other than that player, each draw cards equal to the number of curses attached to that player. So, in Limited, this is going to cost 5 mana to draw you 1 extra card on your opponent's turn. At least, that's what it will do most of the time. Sometimes there might be other curses, but a lot of them aren't very good in this set, so I wouldn't count on it a lot. Still, 5 mana for an extra card on your opponent's turn is kind of alright, and certainly the kind of card advantage that will eventually win you the game. 5 mana is a lot, and you don't add to the board meaningfully either, which is rough, so it is definitely a kind of card that will suffer against more aggressive opponents. It is going to feel good once you get it going, like once you get to untap and add to your board and start taking advantage of all the cards you're drawing, it's going to feel good. But getting there sometimes might be a little difficult. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Delver of Secrets, which for 1 blue mana is a 1/1 human wizard at uncommon, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you look at the top card of your library, you may reveal that card. If an instant or sorcery card is revealed this way, you transform Delver of Secrets, and when it's transformed, it's Insectile Aberration, a 3/2 human insect with flying. I never really thought they'd reprint this. Obviously, this is a multi-format all-star in Constructed and one of the best creatures ever printed. This is because in Constructed you can make a deck where it is trivially easy to flip this, effectively making it a 1-mana 3/2 with flying. In Limited, that's not going to be quite as easy. This will really only be worth playing in a deck that has a bunch of instants and sorceries in it, which generally will mean blue-red. And if you don't flip it right away, that's not a big deal. The good news is a 3/2 flyer is relevant pretty much all game long, so even if you play this on turn 1 and it doesn't flip until like turn 4, you're going to feel okay about it. Thing is, though, if you've just got a few spells, it's unplayable because it may never transform, and a 1-mana 1/1 just isn't worth it. As a result, I think this needs a build-around grade. I think it's going to be a D in your typical blue deck, and probably a C+ in a deck that gets there on instants and sorceries, which is much different from its Constructed grade, where, again, it's one of the best creatures ever printed. Next up, it's Devious Cover-Up, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a common instant, and it says counter target spell. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. You may shuffle up to 4 target cards from your graveyard into your library. This is a hard counter, but 4 mana is a ton to have available just at the right time, and the additional value this gives you just isn't going to make up for that. Though it probably does save it from this just being an F. I'm giving this a D-. The problem with this kind of card is just that if your opponent plays around it, you get completely blown out, and just trying to leave up 4 mana to cast this at some point in the game just isn't a good idea unless you have absolutely nothing else to do. Next up, it's Dissipate, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon instant, and it says counter target spell. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. 3 mana counter spells, especially those that cost double blue, usually aren't great in Limited. The cost of leaving that mana up can be very real, as I've just discussed with a 4 mana counter spell. Generally, you'd rather be adding to the board while you can. But a 3 mana counterspell is a lot better than a 4 mana counterspell, and the fact that this exiles things it counters really matters in this format, where if you counter a card with Flashback or a card that has Disturb, you're getting a whole lot of value, or at least taking away a whole lot of value from your opponent. It's still a counterspell, and it's not great because, again, you have to have your mana up at the exact right time for it to work, and that's very difficult to do in most games of Limited, but I think it's solid, I think it's playable, I think it's a C. Next up, it's Drownyard Amalgam, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 3/6 zombie horror at common. When it enters the battlefield, target player mills 3 cards, and you can pay 2 generic and a blue, and it can't be blocked this turn. This sets up graveyard value for you and has a decent defensive body, not to mention an ability that will sometimes help you close out the game. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Fading Hope, which for 1 blue mana is an uncommon instant, and it says return target creature to its owner's hand. If its mana value is 3 or less, scry 1. 1 mana to bounce a creature is a pretty nice deal. You don't trade card for card, of course, but there is massive tempo to be gained when you bounce something larger, and then there's of course the blowout potential of casting this on a creature in response to a trick or aura being put on it. And one nice thing here is that if you do bounce something that doesn't give you quite as much of a tempo advantage, you get to scry, and that's nice additional upside to have. It's also a cheap spell for blue and red and for day and night purposes. Overall, it seems solid. This sort of bounce spell is pretty much always a C, and I think that's what this is too. Next up, we've got Falcon Abomination, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 zombie bird at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed. So these creature tokens are way powered down versions of creature tokens, obviously, because if this just made a regular zombie, it'd be crazy. These Decayed tokens can't block, and when they attack, you have to sacrifice them at end of combat. This is a Windrake, though, with some reasonable upside. The zombie token doesn't give you quite as much value as a normal zombie token would, but it does still add to the board in a way, and that will have some impact. The 2 bodies will be nice sacrifice fodder, and they'll also just be good at pressuring your opponent, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Firmament Sage, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 2/3 human wizard at uncommon, and it says if it's neither day nor night, it becomes day as Firmament Sage enters the battlefield. Whenever day becomes night or night becomes day, draw a card. This has some ugly stats, but it has an ability that could be a card drawing engine. If it manages to stick around, it is definitely going to net you cards, and that's pretty nice. This is definitely the kind of payoff for night and day changing that will be really, really good. It is hard to get over the mediocre stats, and obviously night and day can be sort of finicky things that you can't always make go your way, so I think this is probably just a C+. With night and day being these interesting new mechanics, I could definitely see Firmament Sage being better than this, though. Next up, it's Flip the Switch, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common instant. It says counter target spell unless its controller pays 4. Create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed. This isn't quite a hard counter, but it ends up being one in a lot of games, and adding to the board while you counter a thing isn't bad, even if what you're adding is a token that can't block and can only attack once. You'll cut this a fair bit, but it'll make the cut often enough to be a C-. Next up, it's Gale Drifter, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/2 Hippogriff at common. It's got flying and Disturb for 4 generic and a blue, and when it comes back with Disturb, it comes back as Whale Drifter, which is a Hippogriff Spirit. It's a 2/2 with flying, and like all of these Disturb cards, if it would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, you exile it instead. A 4-mana 3/2 flyer is like a C-, so getting a second body out of this one, even if it isn't the most efficient one, is going to be some nice additional value. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Geist Wave, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant, and it says return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. If you controlled that permanent, draw a card. This is a neat design for a bounce spell. Bouncing an opposing non-land permanent for 2 mana is usually an alright card. It doesn't give you the value of a whole card, as we talked about with other bounce spells, but it does have some blowout potential. Using this to bounce your own thing is actually really interesting though, since you do net a card, and if what you're bouncing gives you some value from bouncing it, that's going to feel pretty good, especially if you do it in response to removal or something like that. It's probably just a C, but the bounce your own stuff upside is very real. Next up, it's Grafted Identity, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a rare enchantment aura. It says as an additional cost to cast it, sacrifice a creature, enchant creature, you control enchanted creature gets +1/+1. Mind control effects are always super strong. They allow you to simultaneously remove your opponent's best creature and give it to yourself. That's a game-changing effect. This does it for only 4 mana, which is great, and it even pumps the creature. It is balanced somewhat by the fact that you have to sacrifice one of your own creatures. Even with that requirement, though, Grafted Identity is really strong, especially because this format has so many cards that give you 2 bodies for 1, between things that make zombie tokens and cards with Disturbed, among other things. You still take your opponent's best thing and put it on your side of the table, and having to give up a creature for that, while a real downside, is very worth the price. I think this is still a bomb. It probably wouldn't be if this format didn't have all these zombie tokens and Disturb cards running around, but I think the value those cards give you makes sacrificing a creature to this much less of a penalty than it would normally be. I think this is an A-. Next up, it's Larder Zombie, which for 1 blue is a 1/3 zombie at common. It's got Defender, and it says tap 3 untap creatures you control. Look at the top card of your library. You may put it into your graveyard. A 1-mana 1/3 isn't amazing, especially when it has Defender. We've seen 1-mana 1/3s without Defender be bad and limited, so yeah, this can block and kill X1s, I guess. Its ability asks for several creatures in play, and the idea there is that you'll be making these zombie tokens that aren't good for a whole lot because they can only attack once and can't block, but if you have a bunch of them, you can use them for an ability like this. The ability itself isn't bad, as it can give you card selection and help you load up the graveyard, but it just doesn't feel like Larder Zombie is going to be worth a whole card in your deck most of the time. I just don't think it does enough. Everything it does is very, very minimal. I think it's just a D+. Next up, it's Lier, Disciple of the Drowned, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 3/4 legendary human wizard at Mythic Rare. It says spells can't be countered, and each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard has flashback. The flashback cost is equal to that card's mana cost. So, if you're a spell deck and you play this and you get to untap, it's going to be pretty hard for you to lose. Chances are good that by the time you cast this, you'll have at least 1 or 2 things you can flashback in your graveyard, and if you have 6 mana on the next turn, casting 2 of those things won't even be out of the question. Lier is really going to take over games a significant chunk of the time when you cast it. There's some downsides. For one thing, you have to actually get to untap most of the time to reap the rewards, but the fact is, again, if you do untap with Lier in play and you're playing blue, especially if you're playing blue-red, you're probably going to get some insane value on your turn, and it will just snowball from there. I could give it a build around gray, but it's hard for me to imagine that there is going to be a blue deck in this format that can't make this into a bomb. It will be a little better in blue-red for sure, but there's plenty of spells for you to cast with this. I think this is an A-. Next up, it's Locked in the Cemetery, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common enchantment aura. When it enters the battlefield, if there are 5 or more cards in your graveyard, you tap Enchanted Creature, and Enchanted Creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. So if this always tapped the thing you attached it to, it would be premium removal. 2 mana for that effect is pretty great. However, in the early game, making it do that is going to be pretty challenging. By the mid game, it becomes doable. Overall, I think having to have a loaded up graveyard to make this work perfectly does keep it from being premium, but it's still a pretty good blue common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Malevolent Hermit, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 human wizard at rare. You can pay 1 blue and sack it to counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 3, and it has Disturb for 2 generic and a blue, and when you disturb it, it comes back as Benevolent Geist, a spirit wizard that's a 2/2 flyer, and says non-creature spells you control can't be countered. This looks pretty good. On the front, it has passable stats and a very real activated ability that will often interfere with how your opponent wants to play the game, and then once he trades for something or counters a spell, he comes back as a Windrake. The fact your stuff can't be countered isn't huge and limited, but it is some additional upside on what's already a very nice card. This is a B. Next up, it's Memory Deluge, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a rare instant. It says look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast this spell. Put 2 of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, and it has flashback for 5 generic and 2 blue. This is a pretty nice draw spell. When you pay 4, you look at 4 cards and choose 2, which is a good deal for an instant. Then when you flash it back later, you get even more card selection. It is really nice it's an instant because it feels like we've seen a lot of sorcery draw spells lately, and those are far clunkier as you make it obvious how you're spending your turn when you have to cast a sorcery to draw cards. And if you have Deluge mana up, you can be threatening all kinds of other things, so it doesn't feel nearly as bad that it doesn't add to the board. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Mysterious Tome, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon artifact. You can pay 2 and tap it to draw a card, and you transform it into Chilling Chronicle, which is also an artifact, and you can pay 1 and tap it to tap target non-land permanent, and then you transform Chilling Chronicle. This has a cool design. It will constantly go back and forth. Both sides of the card have a relatively efficient ability. 2 to draw a card or 1 to tap down a non-land permanent is pretty nice. Now you do pay 3 mana up front for something that often won't impact the board right away, and keep in mind even when it transforms it stays tapped, so you can never use both abilities in one turn. You'll use one or the other, and there will definitely be times where you wish you could just stick on one side of the card. But still, this looks like it'll grind out value over the course of a game, both drawing you cards and either slowing down your opponent or allowing you to pressure them thanks to the tap ability. If this format is really fast, this might not be too great, but with Flashback and Disturbed, it seems kind of unlikely this format will be fast. There's definitely some intense curves that we're going to see, so, maybe it ends up being really fast. But right now, I think this looks pretty attractive for grinding out value over a medium or long game. I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Nebulgast Intruder, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/1 spirit. And uncommon, it's got flash, it's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, up to 1 target creature an opponent controls gets -2/-0 until end of turn. This looks pretty good. Lately, we've seen a lot of blue creatures with flash that reduce the power of something when they come down. Some of them have been pretty good, like Fairy Duelist. Others have been pretty mediocre, like Burog Befuddler. I think this one ends up being pretty good. A 3-mana 2/1 with flash and flying is already pretty playable, so adding an ability that at the very least makes you take less damage isn't too shabby. Especially because sometimes reducing a creature's power will enable blocks you just didn't have before, and you'll get a whole card worth of value out of that part of the card alone. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Ominous Roost, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, or whenever you cast a spell from your graveyard, you create a 1/1 blue bird creature token with flying, and this creature can block only creatures with flying. So, obviously, this is the early candidate for my favorite card in the set. I love birds and I love build-arounds, and this gives me both. Obviously, if you don't have enough flashback or disturb going on, you can't really play this. It's going to be an F in many decks. 3 mana for a 1/1 flyer that can't block is abysmal. However, if you can get 3 or more tokens with this, and some decks will be able to do that, it's going to be a pretty real win condition in grindy decks. So, yeah, this definitely needs a build-around grade. It's going to be an F in like a typical blue deck, but probably a B- in a deck that really gets there. These birds will be ending games. Next up, it's Organ Hoarder, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/2 zombie at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 3 cards of your library, then put 1 of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. This is a great common. 4 mana for a 3/2 that draws a card is virtually always something you play, and this is even better than that in most ways since it gives you card selection and loads up your graveyard a bit in a set that cares about that. This is perhaps blue's best common. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Otherworldly Gaze, which for 1 blue is a common instant. It says look at the top 3 cards of your library, put any number of them into your graveyard and the rest back on top of your library in any order, and it's got flashback for 1 generic and a blue. I don't like this very much. Loading the graveyard is important in this format, it's true, But a card that pretty much only does that while giving you some card selection isn't something I'm interested in. There are so many cards that load the graveyard while doing actual other things. We just saw one. It might move up a little bit because in the spell deck it can be cast so cheaply twice, and that might give you some nice triggers, but I have a really hard time seeing this as anything more than a D-. This has you go down a card, and you aren't getting that back most of the time. Next up, it's Overwhelmed Archivist, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 3/2 human wizard at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, then discard a card. It has Disturb for 3 generic and a blue, and it comes back as Archive Haunt, a 2/1 with flying that when it attacks, you loot. You draw a card and discard a card. I think you would almost always play a 3-mana 3/2 that loots when it enters the battlefield, especially in a graveyard set, so the fact that it can give you a second body later in the game is some really great additional upside, especially because that body will loot on every single attack. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Patrician Geist, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 Spirit Knight at rare. It's got flying. Other spirits you control get +1/+1, and spells you cast from your graveyard cost 1 less to cast. This is a Windrake with tons of upside. First, it pumps one of the most common creature types in the format, and if you're in blue, it's going to be tough to end up in a deck where this doesn't pump like 5 of your creatures. And second, it gives you a discount on both Flashback and Disturb, and we've already seen a lot of that in this video. And don't forget, all those Disturb creatures are also spirits. This seems excellent, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Phantom Carriage, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a 4/4 spirit at uncommon. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a card with Flashback or Disturb, put it into your graveyard, and then shuffle. 6 mana 4/4 for flyer isn't great, but if you have an ability on a card like that that's, gives you any value at all, this kind of card tends to be pretty good, and this has an effect that effectively at least gets pretty close to drawing you a card because you put a thing in your graveyard that you can then cast from your hand. Well, from your graveyard. I'm all about that. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Poppet Stitcher, which for 2 generic and a blue is a mythic rare human wizard, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 3 or more creature tokens, you may transform Poppet Stitcher, and it turns into Poppet Factory, an artifact that says creature tokens you control lose all abilities and have base power and toughness 3/3. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may transform Poppet Factory. Making 2/2 decay zombies with an instant or sorcery you play is quite strong. Now, the tokens do have decay, but that's still a pretty huge payoff for playing spells. Once it flips into being a doll factory, it will also make all of your zombie tokens way better, and they will be 3/3s that don't have decay. And if you decide you need more zombies, you can just flip it back to the Stitcher side on your upkeep. Meanwhile, the baseline here is a 3 mana 2/3. This card looks like it'll be good in both blue-black zombies and blue-red spells, and I think it's probably just a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Revenge of the Drowned, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common instant. It says target creature's owner puts it on the top or bottom of their library. You create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed. 4 mana to time ebb something isn't amazing, but it does let you trade 1 for 1 with what you target since your opponent has to draw the card again, and that's okay. The 2/2 zombie, again, not as good as most 2/2 zombies, but it is some additional value you get on a card like this, and it's, kind of a Mana War-like effect that you're getting here. Obviously, the 2/2's not amazing, but it is Mana War-esque. I do think the zombie's a big enough downgrade, though, that this is probably just a C. Next up, it's Secrets of the Key, which for 1 blue mana is a common instant. It says Investigate. If this spell is cast from a graveyard, investigate twice instead. And to investigate, you make a clue artifact token with pay 2 mana, sack it, draw a card, and it has flashback for 3 generic and a blue. Paying 1 blue to investigate isn't great, even to me, and I love clue tokens. In fact, I wish there were more in this set. However, the additional flashback on it is very real and means that in the end, this card ends up being a 3 for 1, even if it does it kind of slowly. I think this seems like a pretty nice card for getting you some serious card advantage. I don't think you probably want more than 1 copy because it doesn't add to the board at all, but I think that first copy should be valued as a C+. Next up, it's Shipwreck Sifters, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/2 spirit at common. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and then discard a card. And when you discard a spirit card or a card with Disturb, you put a +1/+1 counter on Shipwreck Sifters. A 2 mana 1/2 who loots is fine, and this one can get bigger. I don't think you want to discard a spirit or a card with Disturb to it all that often, since the power of those cards is often in the fact that you get the 2 bodies out of them. But you'll discard those things sometimes, and that's nice. Mostly, though, you're probably discarding a land, and really it's just like any other loot, and this is probably just a C-. Next up, it's Scab Wrangler, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 human wizard at uncommon, and it says tap 3 untapped creatures you control, tap target creature. So, this is a 2-mana 2/1 with reasonable upside. In the later part of the game, that ability can actually do some work, though you won't always be in position to activate it. It's another one of these cards that really wants you to be using those decayed tokens. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Sludge Monster, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 5/5 horror at rare, and when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you put a slime counter on up to one other target creature. And it says non-horror creatures with slime counters on them lose all abilities and have base power and toughness 2/2. This looks pretty nice to me. A 5-mana 5/5 that makes something into a vanilla 2/2 when it enters is a good deal. And sure, it isn't straight up removal, but that is going to have a big impact on the board state immediately in most cases, suddenly allowing you to attack in ways that you couldn't before, or keeping your opponent from being able to attack you. The fact that it does it again every time it attacks is pretty impressive too. You can also target your own stuff, like if you have a 1/1 or maybe a 2/2 zombie with decay, this will let you upgrade those cards, but most of the time it'll be more impactful to go after their stuff. Bummer about this card is the fact that, when you attack with it, you get to make something else into a 2/2, but as soon as this creature dies, it ends up losing its ability, obviously because it's not on the battlefield, and all those 2/2s just become what they were before. So attacking with this a lot isn't always going to be possible. You kind of already have to be ahead if you're attacking with this successfully, and obviously if you do, you're really going to solidify your position. This is still a really good card. I think it's a B. Next up, it's Spectral Adversary, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 spirit at mythic rare. It's got flash and flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you can pay 1 generic and a blue any number of times. When you pay this cost 1 or more times, put that many +1/+1 counters on Spectral Adversary, then up to that many other target artifacts, creatures, and or enchantments phase out. A 2-mana 2/1 with flying and flash is already a nice card, and this comes with all kinds of upside like all these adversaries do. You can play it early just to pressure your opponent, and then, if you get it late and have mana to pump it, you not only get a larger creature, but you can phase out some stuff. And phasing is pretty flexible. You can use it to mess with an opposing creature, or use it on one of your own things to save it from removal, among other things. So, imagine paying 4 mana for this to get a 3/2 flyer, and also phasing something out. And again, phasing something out is almost always going to have at least some impact on the game one way or another, and things kind of just scale from there. I think this is a bomb. I think it's an A-. Next up, it's Startle, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant. It says target creature gets -2/-0 until end of turn. Create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with decayed. Draw a card. I don't normally like most blue combat tricks that shrink the power of a creature, but this tacks on enough additional stuff that it seems like it'll be pretty solid. The problem with this kind of card is it can't normally trade card for card, since your creature has to already be big enough to kill the other creature. However, this lets you draw a card and makes you one of those zombies, and that's quite a bit for only 2 mana. The times when you are able to use this card to help you kill an opposing creature will feel insane, but that's still not going to come up that often. I think it's a C. Next up, it's Storm Rider Spirit, which for 4 generic and a blue is a common spirit. It's a 3/3 with flash and flying. This is a reprint, and it was fine in our last visit to Innistrad. It may be a little worse here, as spirits are a little less heavily featured as a tribe in this set. It's nice that it can flash in and ambush block things, and it has okay stats. I think it's probably, yet again, a C. Next up, it's Suspicious Stowaway, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/1 human rogue werewolf at rare. It can't be blocked, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card, then discard a card, and it has Daybound. This means that if within the game it is daytime, this is a side of the card that will come in. It's also true if day and night aren't already being tracked, it will just come in as Suspicious Stowaway. But if it's nighttime, or it becomes nighttime after you play Suspicious Stowaway, it becomes Seafaring Werewolf, which is a 2/1 that also can't be blocked, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. So I would pretty much always play this card, even if it was only ever Suspicious Stowaway. An unblockable creature that loots for you every turn is a pretty nice thing to have around, and would probably be at least a C+. Then you add the nighttime version of the Stowaway to the mix, and it gets even crazier, since it hits harder and now just straight up draws you cards. He is small and fragile on both sides, dying to almost every removal spell in the format, but he will run away with the game in a hurry if your opponent doesn't have an answer. I think this is a B+. Next up, it's Triska Decafile, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/3 human wizard at rare. You have no maximum hand size, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have exactly 13 cards in your hand, you win the game, and you can pay 3 generic and a blue to draw a card. So, It's highly unlikely you ever trigger this alternate win condition, but that's fine. A 2-mana 1/3 that can draw you extra cards in the mid to late game is actually pretty nice, and gives it relevance all game long. Drawing cards is powerful as a mana sink and can usually help you outdraw your opponent in the late game. Meanwhile, it's also a 2-drop that can do some stuff early, though it isn't exactly stellar at that point in the game. Still, drawing cards with this late seems pretty good. I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Unblinking Observer, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 homunculus at common. You can tap it to add blue mana, spend this mana only to pay a disturb cost, or to cast an instant or sorcery spell. This will help you cast enough stuff that it seems like a solid combo, and it fits in well in the blue-red deck and the blue-white deck, which will be the most disturb-heavy deck in the format, giving it a C. And our last blue card is Vivisection, which for 3 generic and a blue is an uncommon sorcery, and it says as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature, draw 3 cards. We've seen a lot of cards that make those decayed zombie tokens in this video, and this is one of the things you can do with those that seems pretty good. This, of course, doesn't add to the board at all, and in fact, it subtracts from it, and sometimes it will be a liability. However, the cards it gives you are a pretty big deal, again, especially if you're sacrificing a decayed zombie to it. I think most blue decks in this format will be interested in the first copy of this, giving it a C+. Alright, those are my thoughts on all the blue cards in Innistrad Midnight Hunt. Tomorrow, I'll be back to talk about black. If you want to stay aware of that future video as well as others, please subscribe and turn on notifications. If you're looking for the rest of this review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And if you enjoyed this video and found it useful, don't forget to share it and like it so that others can watch it too. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all tomorrow.